Joseph was always at Mass, his faith meant so much to him.
And he just lived the Christian values day in, day out, and you could see that in all the dealings that you had with him.
That Joe had friends and people who mourned him when he passed across the whole school. I had the privilege of knowing Joe Wilson and the commitment he gave to his faith and the kind of person that he was in life. I was thrilled at the idea that someone that I've actually known in my past, who's obviously sadly no longer with us, is potentially going to aspire to sainthood at some point in the future, subject of course to the investigations that will be carried out by the Vatican.
When the news came through, I was absolutely delighted. Was I surprised? Maybe not, actually. So I knew Joe. I taught Joe in 4th year, but probably got to know him a bit better when he was in 5th and 6th year. I didn't teach him higher, but I taught him advanced higher. And he was just such a lovely young man.
I taught Joseph for several years in the physics department. He was, I know it's, the script here is that he was the loveliest person you would ever meet. He was the loveliest person you would ever meet. He was very, very, very bright academically, very articulate. He was just the loveliest guy. He got on with every pupil, every group of pupils. You could sit him anywhere. He was diligent, smart, conscientious. He had the work ethic of a student who wasn't bright, but he was really, really bright. He was the model student, but he wasn't like, you know, I'm trying to think, you know, he's not what you would say, I don't know what the stereotypical saint would be if he walked among us. He was an ordinary guy. He was so smart and so bright, but you wouldn't know it unless you taught him, because he was very, very humble.
He always gave 110% of everything that he had whenever you met him, and a very approachable lad. Whether it was, you know, sometimes he would come down for fitness in the gym, or sometimes it would just be out in the corridor. But on every occasion, he was very open and very welcoming to your company. And what I remember at the time, I had not long, well, my wife at the time had not long had a couple of our children, and Joe, he stood out from, you know, just from your kind of normal chat, because he would consider not just yourself but the family, and he'd always make a point of asking, you know, how everyone's getting on, and you know, there was a maturity there that was fantastic to see and be interacting with.
He was so respected by the year group and by others across the school. Never mind how well liked he was as a young man in terms of his academic life, and also what he did and what he contributed to the wider community of the school. And that just grew and grew as he got into the final stages of S6. So it was someone who he would try everything in terms of his school. So he wasn't a lad who, I knew him from a PE point of view, and also about the school as pupil support. But he was always willing to give his best forever. That's always remember about Joe, that he was very able academically, of course, and that was reflected in his results. But at the same time, he was someone who just liked to get involved and just looked like he loved life within Taylor High.
I think he was planning doing medicine. I think he'd already got, I think it was like 5 A's or something, and he's higher. So he was, in one regard, he was destined for great things. But he was a dead humble guy as well. You wouldn't have known that. He wouldn't have seen himself better or worse than anybody else. Just a smashing guy.
I always remember thinking, you know, when I had any dealings with Joe, I was like, right, Joe, one or two things you're going to be here. You're either going to be a medic or you're going to be a priest. And he actually did choose to do medicine. Unfortunately, that didn't quite materialise.
And Joe Wilson was someone who had time for everybody, who cared about everyone he had dealings with, who saw the worth in every person, I think, that he dealt with, and was someone who the class recognised the qualities that Joe had And they completely bought into the fact that Joe Wilson, in a sense, was a kind of superstar in the school at the time, but for all the right reasons. It was nothing to do with pop music or movies. It was to do with the kind of person that he was. If you had an issue and you needed help with it, they all knew that they could go and ask Joe for help and they would get it. It was just one of those moments when you become aware of the depth of good that still exists in young people when they can turn and actually make that judgment in that moment. And given the passage of time now, they're all much older, we all are, and we're in a situation where Joe's cause for canonization has gone to Rome. You know, they were very prescient in their judgment at that time and in that moment.
And in the class as well, he had a degree of humility where he was the top of the class, but he never assumed it. You know, and it was a lovely thing to see. And he spent a lot of his time when he volunteered to, you know, help the younger kids in the class too, and just sharing his time and his knowledge and his effort. And I always remember we would take the children to Ben Nevis for the St Andrew's Hospice, and that year I remember Joe and his friend, I think Chris, they had came with us that year, and I remember at one point when we were, you know, just pretty much at the top, he threw himself in his arms out and shouted and announced I'm the tallest man in the world, or in Britain at this point. So he had a real humour about him too. But my lasting memory is just of a very unassuming, very nice, very kind and gentle, and very, very clever young man.
One of my last memories of Joe Wilson was a PE memory. So the week or so before the seniors went off for exam break, exam leave in April, May, I had a class outside. We were playing softball and Joe was playing. And Joe's on the bat, and I think I may have been pitching, or I was involved anyway. And Joe hit and ran, and as he ran to first base. And the person, it was obviously going to be a close call, but the person who was in first base and him, and Joe ran by him to get safe at base, but he knocked his hand or his wrist against the other boy. And it looked quite innocuous, but I looked and thought, that's a sore one. And immediately Joe went down, holding his wrist. Long story short was that it was broken. As I say, very innocuous. Never complained. And went away, got it checked, and of course the next day about the school, Joe Wilson's in Stookie, and it's his right hand, which is his writing hand. But Joe, being Joe, laughed it off and said, don't worry, I'll do my exams with my left hand, right? And he came out with his 5 A's. So a number of staff came down and checked in with me what happened to Joe Wilson, because he was obviously such a capable lad, doing his 5 hires at that point, and he managed to get him, and as I say, the rest is history with these results.
I remember one of the times I was teaching advanced higher and I was called out to deal with an issue, and when I come back in, Joe was standing teaching at the board to the rest of the advanced higher, and they were absolutely captivated. And I remember looking at them thinking, I might take some of these strategies for my own teaching actually. And it was just great.
We had the visit by Pope Benedict, a historic occasion for all of us in this country. And then in the year that followed, resources were produced for us to use in school to build on that visit and have the opportunity to work with classes. And at the time, I always taught religious education, usually to 5th or 6th year. And in that particular year, so this would now be the year after the papal visit, so we're talking about, in actual fact, we didn't know it at the time, but the final months of Joe's life. I was working with a 6th year RE class that included Joe Wilson, and I didn't teach him for all of the time until his tragic passing in December of that year. We rotated the classes, but during the period when I had the class, I was working with a particular resource that had been produced to support the period after the papal visit, and that was a resource called Saints for the 21st Century. And in the lessons that you were working with pupils on, it was important that, on the one hand, yes, that they understood that there were some very high-profile people who potentially, and indeed in some cases did, aspire to sainthood, like, for example, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. But the purpose of the lessons was also to try and get across the fact that round us, day and daily, there are aspects of saintliness that we see in our everyday lives. The whole class, as one person, turned immediately once they had grasped the idea and pointed at Joe and said to me, "Sir, Joe Wilson, he's a perfect example of that." And Joe, of course, who was still with us at that point, and neither he nor I nor any of us knew that he was in the final stages of his own life, he took that with very easy grace. The young people were all, 17 years of age approximately, 6 years in the final stage of their secondary education. They didn't say that with any hint of cynicism at all. They knew Joe, and by that stage I was getting to know him much better, even though it was coming towards the end of his life. And it was just a privilege to have him in the class and have the insight that you got from him. But it was also the knowledge that Joe at no point had any awareness of his own holiness. Joe did what he did. Joe was Joe Wilson.
But I always remember when Joe was unwell, and we heard that Joe was unwell, speaking to my mum, and my mum was the member of a mother's prayers at the time, and I said, just please ask all the mums to pray for Joe. And they did all pray for Joe.
This school's had lots of tragedies, and especially around about that time, we just seemed to be in the eye of the storm of a number of pupils dying, a number of staff dying, and they all came in quick succession. But that one was just, you thought, my word, and aye, everybody was saying what sort of prayers and rosaries. I think that on the Sunday night there was a vigil down in the grotto that was very, very well attended. I can remember that, and then it was after that. So that was a few days after that initial event, and it was that night somebody says to me, "Listen, he's not going to make it." I mean, because you're saying these prayers, everybody's saying rosaries and going to masses and thinking in masses getting said, and you're praying for a good recovery. Do you know what I mean? Here's a future star, and sadly it wasn't to be.
It was a real shock. It was obviously we'd known that he had been ill, but it's always a shock when a young person dies. But I think anybody who taught Joe made a connection with him that you wouldn't say. I've taught a lot of pupils who've got A's in higher physics and advanced higher, who I would say I know from teaching them, but you don't connect with everybody. People are busy, the students and the staff are busy, but everybody, I think, who met Joe, even if they taught him briefly or knew him in any sort of pastoral capacity, would say that he connected with them and they made a connection with him just on every level. He was... So I wouldn't even say it's a retrospective thing. At the time, he was just the loveliest guy. He was the most popular boy, not because he was flamboyant and really, exceptionally outgoing. He had a great sense of humour. As I say, he was very bright. He had a dry sense of humour. He was an all-rounder, as I say, socially and academically.
The next thing that happened after Joe's death and in the aftermath of his funeral was that his father came to visit me one day, and it was an unusual visit because he had a big bundle of jotters with him, and they were Joe's jotters. And he quickly explained to me, Alan Wilson, Joe's dad, that he'd been about to throw the jotters out, but had discovered that in actual fact Joe had been keeping a diary and having then the ability to read the diary. That was where the real privilege came in, because you were then given the insight of being able to read the diary and understand that actually the way in which Joe Wilson had presented to me such a short time before in person was absolutely borne out by his writings.
We were so overwhelmed that those kind of memoirs, those kind of thoughts, those writings would come from someone of his age. And I always remember thinking it was almost quite like St. Therese.
In this case, however, what struck you immediately was the fact that Joe was in many respects a normal teenage boy of his generation and of his time. But it was deeply imbued with an absolutely immense depth of faith and indeed understanding of his faith. An understanding, I think, of the stage in his faith journey that he was at that point in his life. And you had to marvel at the ability of someone so young, not trained as a theologian or not trained in the ways of writing on behalf of the church, nonetheless being able to write things that meant something to me as a much, much older adult who had by that stage experienced a large chunk of his life. And many other people, of course, have seen it since.
I didn't meet Joe, but I've heard a lot about him. And his legacy still lives on in many ways within the school. What struck me and what has been shared with me is that he was gifted. He was really bright. He was well liked by everybody, lots of different groups. And when you talk about somebody being gifted, sometimes that can in some ways dehumanise them. That's not the sense I got from what all I've heard and learned about Joe. He was a very normal, lovable, loving guy. The one thing I think that has struck me, two things actually that have struck me from what I've heard about Joe was he was incredibly bright, but everything seemed to be viewed through an optic of faith for him. And I think that's part of the excitement because we've had Carlo Acutis, we've had Pope Benedict talking, giving that challenge to young people to be saints for the 21st century. And that sense of young people being called to sainthood is not something abstract, not something philosophical. And with something like Carlo Acutis, we can see that, and young people can see that and relate to somebody who has made a choice to follow Christ in their life. It's a member of our own community. Now that is incredibly exciting.